Of you who are on YouTube, we are on our way to yet another service, teaching, whatever you want to call it. And I'm really excited because this season gives us so much information. And so I'm going to do a lot of recapping today in order to get to a point. So it might be a little bit long. We may have to break it up a little bit when we actually do the editing, but for those of you who are joining us on live stream, I encourage you to stick with it because I think this is going to be very insightful for you and probably one of those things where you are going to have an opportunity to be better, right? We're always trying to do better. We're trying to become more like our Savior, so to speak. Okay. So having said that, I'm just gonna jump into the whiteboard right off the bat and go for it because we just need to get into it. So let's see. Let's start with a whiteboard. And what we're gonna do here is just kind of recap everything. Let me get some colors going here. Okay, yep, I think that's probably good. And I think I probably want that to be, let's go with blue. I think blue is a good color for that. And then, of course, let's go with green. Those seem to be the best colors for the teachings as far as any feedback that I've gotten about being able to see the colors. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. So we have what? We have Passover, right? Which we recently had. Okay, and then we have Pentecost coming up, right? And I'm using the English words for now, okay? And this is tabernacles. Okay, and what do these three feasts have in common? Let's go ahead and actually, you know what? I think I'm going to probably use orange here for the dots. Actually, no, I could use yellow. Okay, so we have a dot here, we have a dot here, we have a dot here, and this is a timeline. Okay, that's a timeline. That timeline begins actually out here and technically kind of ends out here. We will get to that in a minute. Okay. But the premise is that these are called the mandatory feasts. Okay. So let's go ahead and put mandatory up here. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna do that. I'm not gonna say mandatory because that kind of gives the impression like you are forced to go to these feasts, when the truth is these feasts were actually a choice. And unfortunately, because they were a choice, the nation of Israel was not very zealous to keep them. Now, when I say a choice, please bear in mind that I don't mean a choice that necessarily results in you being prosperous if you don't participate in them. Okay. So the way this works is this point out here. Let's put this point out here. Okay, is somewhere in what we would call February. Okay. And then this point out here is somewhere towards November. Okay. And so that kind of can give you a ballpark on your pagan calendar, because I know that you guys are kind of in a situation where you're forced to live by the pagan calendar. But in principle, that time period from, let's see, I'm going to do orange for this one, I think. That time period from here to here is the flood. Ish, okay? Not exact, but pretty darn close, okay? And so when we're talking about the concept of the flood, that is our encapsulation, if you were, of the beginning and the end of the flood. Now, there are a few things that are important about that. Remember, it was kind of this principle of about 120 days ish, right? And in that time period, the world is under judgment. Okay. So what does that mean? That means that the time period that was chosen for the flood to be present on the earth was during what we would like to call, see if I can get away with, purple here. I don't know if that's necessarily a good color or not. I'm going to try it. So this whole period from here to here is called the feast day season. Okay? It's a season. What do I mean by season? It's an ebb and flow, right? All that kind of stuff. Now, what is important about this is that one corresponds with the other. In other words, the feast day season is a time period of judgment. Okay? And so let's talk a minute about judgment. So we can talk about what judgment is and what judgment is not. So first of all, what I want you to do is let go of your Christianese mindset concerning judgment. Take the book of Revelations, put it in a cabinet, lock the door in your brain, and don't let yourself in there, okay? Because that's where people go when they think about judgment. But the truth is that judgment is actually a commandment, okay? So it says in the Torah, in specifically the Torah section of Mishpatim, that's judgments. These are the judgments that were given to the people of Israel. These are the judgments that you are to give to the people of Israel. That's how that parasha starts. Now, for those of you who are watching for the first time, let me say, the short version of this. Parasha is a list of sections of Torah that are read over a one-year time, created presumably by the Ezra generation, probably Ezra himself. They designed it in such a way that it could be read over a 6-day period. Each section could be read over a 6-day period. And then on the 7th is the Sabbath, and there's a final reading and there's a teaching around that, okay? Of course, we see that acknowledged by James, who is the leader of the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15, verse 21. For there is in the synagogue on Sabbath, Moses preached from ancient times, right? Okay. So that's the parasha. Now, the reason that this is important is because the parasha Mishpatim begins with, these are the judgments that you shall give to the children of Israel. So let's just take a moment and let's drop our thought process on judgment for a second and think about what is going to come next. Well, the first thing on the list that happens is they talk about Hebrew slaves, right? Talk about Hebrew slaves, and then they go into an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. These are judgments. So let's talk a minute about what that would be presumably attached to, okay? Let's make some assumptions here. So the first assumption we need to make is that a judgment is not what we understand it to be, okay? Second is that judgment process is a concept of weighing in the scale, so to speak. Let me explain. So, for example, in the parasha of Mishpatim, in the book of Exodus, or the section of Torah called Shemot, or names, there is a place that talks about murder, okay, and talks about if that you lie in wait with intention to kill, that is murder. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. However it is that you killed the person, you have to die the same way. If it is an accident, then there is manslaughter, and you are to go to what? A city of refuge. A walled city designed by the Torah, right? The Torah gives instruction on how to build these cities. A walled city that contains people, keeps people in, will not allow them to go out, right? Unless the high priest has died, and that's when they're allowed to be released. That's when they're allowed to come out. Well, that sounds an awful lot like prison, but we'll leave that alone. So manslaughter, you go to jail. Murder, you die, right? That's technical for Torah. But here's my point. Why is that commandment being given in that way in Torah? What is it teaching? Well, first of all, who is the determining person for murder? Who was to met out the execution of somebody who killed somebody else? The accuser, right? The accuser has to be the one to execute the judgment, as it were. However, who determines the guilt? The high priest, right? Or a priest. Why is that important? Well, then we get into the thought process that the judge themselves has to discern between manslaughter and murder. Meaning what? A judgment is to give you mitigating factors on an extreme of the law. The Torah is the maximum extent of the law. Let me explain what I mean. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You punch somebody in the eye, and it injures their eye. Torah says that you have to what? Have your eye injured. However, there's no factor of mercy being brought into that, and I will remind you that is the first emanation of God. Chesed, or mercy, is the first emanation of God, and therefore is the governing factor on all judgment. Judgment answers to mercy in the emanations of God, in the attributes of God. Now, why would that be important? Well, first of all, there are two elements. The first one is that obviously we need to be able to discern, right? We need to be able to look between one or the other to decide the guilt or the execution of the person. And that needs to also determine the mitigating factors of it. So we go from murder to manslaughter, etc. Now, here's the interesting thing. Then what we have is this idea that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But then Yeshua says what? He says that, but I say, right? Now, is he modifying Torah there? No. And so what we need to understand is he's taking it to a greater extreme. He's starting to expose the heart. He says, if you hate, then you've already committed murder in your heart, right? He's telling you to change your heart, change your thinking, right? On how you operate, because this is what's going to result. If you've already committed it in your heart, you're probably going to commit it. Which is interesting, because that also gives those people who discern that kind of fruit an opportunity to prepare themselves for that action from that person. Having said all that, I think it's important to understand that Torah is the extreme of the law. So keep that in mind. Torah is the extreme of the law. Then we apply mercy, okay? And there's plenty of places that are indicative of mercy. In fact, when Yahweh puts Moses in the cleft of the rock and walks by him, and he sees the back parts, as it were, then of course, the first thing he declares is Yahweh, Yahweh Raham, right? Yahweh, the compassionate one. What is compassion? In the ancient pictographic Hebrew, it was the sentiment that what? That we actually would have a pain of experience for a person suffering and a strong desire to release them from it. That's compassion. Well, why is all this relevant? Because now we understand that judgment is actually the concept of having to discern between the extreme and mitigating circumstances of an offense against Torah. Well, it's interesting because the flood was clearly a judgment as we would understand it in Christianese, right? But the truth is that Torah is what? Torah is a agent of benefit to those who are willing to be obedient to it. Of course, that's Deuteronomy 28. Blessed will be your kneading bowl. Blessed will be your flocks. You'll be the head and not the tail, etc. Right? But more so, it is an agent of social justice. You go after other gods, you start worshiping demons, they're going to demand blood of the innocent, right? Not necessarily the innocent in the sense of what we understand about Yeshua, but they would want human sacrifice and they want suffering, right? And I'm not going to get into what the demonic actually is or any of that. All I'm saying is that Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 15 and 16 say that it's not actually other gods, but it's demons. Okay, enough about that. But what's important to understand is that it's a social injustice. Going after other gods, idolatry leads to social injustice. What else does? Greed, right? There are instructions in Torah about greed. You're not allowed to charge interest. Can you imagine a nation that did not, a capitalist nation that did not have interest? Whoa, right? And then what else? Have to take care of the widows and orphans. You have to, in fact, there's a commandment in Torah that says you're not allowed to have the poor among you. That's a judgment. In what way? Well, number one, obviously, it's going to give us our definition, right? But then what's the violation? So let's say that we do have the poor among us, right? Well, Yeshua said you would always have the poor among you, which means what? That there would be a reciprocation of poorness, as it were. In other words, if you don't start taking care of the poor, you're going to become poor. Simple as that. You start taking care of the poor, you're going to be elevated. That's not rocket science. We learned that in the first 2-3 years of this ministry. You can go back and watch those videos. But here is an element of judgment that people don't understand, and that is that there's a force of benefit, right? So we have this idea in our brains that judgment means this, like, God waiting for you to do something wrong so he can just slap you up across the head, right? When the truth is that judgment is actually a person falling and a person catching them. So we're going to get more into judgment in a minute. But now that I've explained to you what a feast day season is in terms of judgment, you understand that the feast day season is a force of benefit. Judgment, the flood, was a force of benefit. Now, I'm sure all of the dead people, where we have that bottleneck in our DNA, where it goes from thousands and thousands of people down to nothing and then back up into thousands and millions and billions now, I'm sure that they probably would not be of the opinion that it was a force of benefit. But when we get into the concept or idea of it being maybe either a deterrent, right? Or also potentially an element to prove the divinity, right? To prove that God exists. Now, I see this over and over and over in Torah. It'll say that's how you'll know that I am the Lord God. He says it to Pharaoh. That's how you know that I'm the Lord of God, Lord your God, or that I am the Lord God. It says it in the actual judgments of Passover, right? The actual plagues, right? He says, now you will understand that I am even the God of your land, right? we go into Ezekiel chapter 36. He says, look, man, you guys went into exile, and I even know I appointed those nations to take you into exile. They overdid it because why? They're saying, I can't deliver you. So I'm gonna deliver you just to prove that I am the Lord God. Over and over and over and over and over again, it's about establishing the proof per se. Okay, so the flood plays that role for sure. Okay, all that just to show you this next part. Okay, so let's get back to our board. All right, so now what we need to do is go ahead, and I think what I want to do, I've actually never tried this before. I'm going to try this though. What I want to do is actually shrink this down, and we will move it over here. And then I'm gonna, let's see if I can actually make a copy here. It doesn't look like I can. Nope, no copy. Okay, that's fine. We will just use the one that we already had, and I'll just erase some lines. Okay, so let's see, we're gonna get rid of this purple line, get rid of this red one, get rid of this. Let's go ahead and let's get rid of this. And let's get rid of this. Clean up the board just a smidge. We can get rid of these. And I'm sorry if I'm messing up your notes, but there's a reason why I'm doing this. I don't want this to get confusing because we're going to draw a bunch of lines here. Okay, so we can leave the flood up there. And then let's see, I want to do a red and then a green. No, okay, yeah, let's not do red. Let's do green here. Let's do it like that. Okay. So now what we have is we have this cyclical wave going on. And that's going to be important here in a minute. But I really want to kind of emphasize this concept right here. Okay, because there was also an ebb and flow in the flood too. Now, why am I bringing up the flood? Well, because it's interesting that of the time period that it was chosen for it to be present on the earth, it was chosen during these feast days. Okay, now here's the process. From Passover, the people of Israel are led into the wilderness, right? And there is a decline in physical comfort. Okay? Decline, or a descendancy, as it were. There's a decline on physical. But what do we have? We have crazy things happening. What do we have? We have water from the rock. Let's just list them here. Water from rock, right? Then we have what? We have manna. And then we have what? We have the defeat of Amalek through supernatural means, right? All of those specifically are special. All of those are specifically special and exclusively demonstrating a divine connection through all this, okay? So on the one side, we have contained within here this idea of a spiritual incline, right, connected to this process. And then we have a physical decline connected to this process right here. Okay. Which means what? There is going to be a point in time where there's a decline here. I don't want to scribble on this too much. I don't want to get confused with the lines here. So what is this, right? What is going on here? It seems as though when there is a physical decline, there is a spiritual incline. When there is a physical incline, there is a spiritual decline. And we see that ebb and flow through those three mandatory feasts. Okay? And so why is that important? Well, first of all, Passover itself, right, was about what? Let's talk about that for a minute. What was Passover? What was it really? Well, according to Jeremiah chapter 31 through 33, which I will just go ahead and pull up for you, and we will take a look at this, right? Jeremiah chapter 31, starting in verse 31. We are going to encounter a very different process here. So let's see, let's get here. There we go. The day is coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and Judah. This is the covenant I will be, this covenant will not be like the one I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand and brought them out of the land of Egypt. What's going to be different about it? Let's take a look. Let's just look and see what is the difference. It says, they broke that covenant, though I love them as a husband loves his wife, says the Lord. Okay, we know that that's not actually what it says in the Hebrew. It doesn't say I love them as a husband. It says I was a husband to them. Now, verse 33 says, but this is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel on that day, says Yahweh. I will put my instructions deep within them. I will write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. Okay, so where do we encounter that, right? Where do we encounter this? We encounter this when we hear from Paul. Paul uses it twice in the same chapter. Chapter 2 of Romans, when he says, if a Gentile, though not having law, does the things of the law, and then gives a very specific description. Number one, they're a law unto themselves. Don't even want to get into that today. But number two, shows that the law has been written on their hearts. Why was that important? Because of Jeremiah 31. Remember, Romans is a letter or a debate with Pharisees in Rome, right? How do we know? Because it says brethren, right? Brethren is their little indication that they're a Pharisee, right? Okay, so to the brethren, right? Or talking to the brethren. And he even says, and speaking to you, brethren, who know the law, right? Okay, so this is what he says. He says, Gentile not having the law unto themselves, law written on their heart, and what? That they show themselves circumcised. That they show themselves circumcised, which means what? They get the Abrahamic promise as well. Okay, so now he's like, look, Gentiles are getting this, right? Okay. Why is that important? Because the first covenant is activated as a promise or premise of the of the captive bride. The Yeshua principle is activated. Let me remind you about the cycle of Israel. Okay, so we're going to jump back over to the board for a minute. So in the cycle of Israel, we have the 4 points, right? We have this concept of death, okay? And then we have this concept of resurrection. There's 2 S's there. And then we have this concept of maturity. And then we have this concept of disobedience, right? We have this concept of what we would call a breakdown or entropy. Breakdown in the process. And what is that breakdown? Well, it has to do with disobedience. It has to do with the way in which we act towards God, etc., etc. Okay, so the premise is that somewhere between here and here, the discomfort gets strong enough that there is actually a crying out, okay? And the Yeshua principle is activated. What is the Yeshua principle? Well, I will remind you that the name Jesus is a transliteration of a transliteration of a transliteration. What's a transliteration? When you try to pronounce something, only you use your alphabet instead of the alphabet that was used. So we have Yeshua going to Jesus in the Greek. Why? Because there was no SH letter in the Greek. Well, then we have Jesus going into the Latin, and then later on the Latin getting that first I of every word that had the I at the beginning, instead of it having that yeah sound, yeah, right? It's j, right? J. The J is added, and the y becomes the j, and the j, right? So that's where we get Jesus, so to speak. But that has no meaning. The name Jesus has no meaning. It doesn't have a traceable root. You would have to go all the way back to the name Yeshua or Yehoshua or Yahashua, however it works out in the vowels, which means what? Salvation, but not how people would think. The premise is that now is what? A infinitive. So we need to take it back to its lexical root. Its lexical root is yasha. Yasha comes from a root that is a sheen ayin, which is a drawing of two front teeth and an eyeball, right? I could put all this on the board, but it's so much more fun to just describe it to you here. And what does that mean? That means destroyer watches. So what's the Yeshua principle? The destroyer is watching in order to snatch you away from danger violently. What is that? That's the shepherd with the club about to bash the wolf who's got the lamb in the teeth. Right? We're going to tear the lamb out of the wolf's mouth and smash his skull. That is the Yeshua. Okay, that's the Yeshua principle. So crying out activates the Yeshua principle. Violent snatching away, right? Where's our violent snatching away? How about 10 horrible, destructive, social civilization destroyed by all of these plagues. And he takes them out by the hand. He says, come on, let's go. Right? Remember how the angel grabbed Lot and drug him out of the city because he was hemming and hawing? Okay? Okay. So we understand how the Yeshua principle is activated. Once the Yeshua principle is activated, now as this group of people are brought out into the wilderness, according to Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 32, this covenant will not be like the covenant, right, that I made with them when I brought them out of the land. They broke that covenant, though I loved them as a husband loves his wife. And of course, we know that's though I was a husband to them. All right, so what's the point? The point is that they were taken without permission, as it were, from Egypt. They cried out, they were ripped out of Pharaoh's hands and became a captive bride of Yahweh. So the rule concerning the captive bride of Yahweh is in Deuteronomy. And so I'm going to navigate there. But one of the things that we need to keep in mind when we are talking about the captive bride is an understanding of the concept of enemies, etc., etc. Okay. So short version of this is that let's say that I have a clan of people who are living in a certain area and we need to expand, okay? We're bigger than the other one, and so the concept is simple, and it doesn't really matter whether you like this or not. The bigger group is the authority. You say, well, that's not fair. I mean, the majority is or the minority needs to have some acknowledgement or whatever. Fine. They can enter into covenant with the bigger group. And that's an agreement that you won't encroach upon that land. There was plenty of land to go around, right? But the principle is that that land would be claimed or not claimed. And if it was not claimed and you went to go claim it and somebody said, oh, wait a minute, I was going to claim that, then we have some sort of conflict, and that conflict needs to be resolved through covenant. If the conflict is not resolved, then there is a action of tribute being required. Why? Because there's still a necessity for that expansion. You say, well, then just stop having people. Yeah, okay. So that's exactly why we have this concept of, a potential extinction event happening during the flood, right? Okay, so the concept here is simple. If I can beat you in battle, I'm an authority over you. And if I can beat you in battle, then you now have to what? Be under my protection. Well, in return for that protection from other entities who could beat you, right? So it's simple. Whoever wins the battle now is the authority. Another one comes along and beats them, then they're the authority, right? That is the concept of victory in the process of the Hebrew lifestyle. What does that equate to? Well, there's a point in time where we start to get into the idea that if you are a nation who is not serving God, and you want to interact with us, then you need to enter in the covenant with us. If not, then we're going to require tribute, right? So now we're requiring tribute. Well, you refuse to pay tribute. So now the value of your people is based upon the labor that would have been required for the tribute according to the crop. What do I mean by that? In its simplicity, it's like this. Let's say that we require tribute of one crop per clan to be brought to us, right? In return for protection from the other nations, from the marauders and all that, right? So the principle is that's required to be brought in. Well, that's not brought in, and there's a rebellion, and therefore now the people who are a part of that clan have now become the enemy of the authority. And if that sounds familiar to you, it should, because that's Romans chapter 5. While we were enemies of God, Christ died for us, right? Okay, so now getting back into our thought process here, we have this idea that now people are going to what? Go to war, have a conflict, and it says, if you go out to war, let's read what it says. Suppose you go out to war against your enemies. Who's an enemy? Somebody who is trying to be contrary to your clan, right? In some way, either they're trying to take over or they are refusing to pay tribute. The war against your enemies, and Yahweh, your Elohim, hands them over to you, and you take some of them as captives. Let's talk about captives for a minute, okay? We are not talking about prisoners of war. We're talking about wiping out a nation whose exercise of social injustice has come before God, and God has decided to exercise judgment upon that. Remember, judgment is a force of benefit to what? Social justice. And so the premise is you're going to go in, you're going to tear down their idols, you're going to burn all their altars and do all that, kill the priests of those false gods, and you're going to wipe everybody out. But if you see somebody who's not been touched by a man yet, and you take them and bring them back to your clan, as opposed to killing them, right? So you decide to let them live, they have to go through a purification process. So now let's pick up right there at that process. Suppose you go out to war against your enemies and Yahweh, your Elohim, hands them over to you and you take some of them as captive. And suppose you see among the captives a beautiful woman and you are attracted to her and want to marry her. If this happens, you take her to your home where she must shave her head and cut her nails and change the clothes she was wearing when she was captured. She will stay in your home, but let her mourn for her father and mother a full month. Then you may marry her, and you will be her husband, and she will be your wife. But if you marry her and she does not please you, you must let her go free. You may not sell her or treat her as a slave, for you have humiliated her. Now, I know that says humiliated there, but that's not what it necessarily says in the Hebrew. But you see the point here. Instead of killing these people, we're going to bring them into the clan, and they are going to what? They're going to work off their tribute. But remember, you have to let somebody like that go after 7 years unless they decide to stay with you. But in this case, she's a free woman. This is not somebody who is a what? Slave. That's important. Because what did Yahweh do to Israel? Brought her out of the land of Egypt, right? Brought her out of the land of bondage, brought her out of the land of limitations, brought her out of the land of limiting beliefs, and says, you're free now, but you are my wife. Okay? Now what happens? Now she goes through the whole process of what? Of being cleansed. We're going to get to that. But this is the covenant that he made with them when he brought them out of the land by their hand. That's what that means. He snatched them out of the wolf's mouth because of the Yeshua principle that was being activated there. And he brings her out of the nation that he defeats as a captive bride. Why is that important? Because the renewed covenant, in other words, the Brit Chadashah that's mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 31 is not a captive bride covenant. Why? The difference between the two is Israel does not need delivered from Egypt again. Okay? We know that there's that whole process that the husband had to die in order for the wife to be released from the law of adultery. And that husband just so happened to also resurrect. And now he has an opportunity for her to come back to him again. Right? And so now she's coming back to him as a new man and her as what? A woman who has not yet been has not been condemned of adultery. So now she gets to come back in, but what do we see? We see in Revelation, let the Spirit and the bride say, come. Furthermore, it says that it was given to her to what? To have the robes of pure white, which are the diatheke, the righteous acts of the saints, which is the same word being used in Romans chapter 8, verse 4, that says that the righteous requirements of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. So what? The second covenant was not captive. Okay? That's important. So when we're dealing with the renewed covenant versus the first covenant, we understand that something new is going to be in that process. And that new process was that choice, right? That opportunity to become the bride. Now, before you start thinking that this is an individual process, please remember that the word bride is not plural. Romans chapter 8 says that all of creation is groaning with birth pains until now for the revealing of the power of the sons of God. Sons, plural. But then we sit down at the marriage feast in Revelation chapter 19, and it's the bride, not brides, right? So what does that mean? There is a corporate, Israel was a corporate, collective, captured bride. The bride of Yeshua. How do we know? Because Yeshua was slain from the foundations of the earth. So the same lamb that's present in Revelation 19 is joined to the captive bride Israel that's brought out of Egypt, who is a nation overnight. Remember, there is a scripture that says, can a nation become a nation overnight? And yet, what have we here, right? So the premise is what I want you to get your mind around is that's the only difference between the two covenants. Look at verse 33 of Jeremiah 31. Okay, verse 33 says, but this is the new covenant I will make with the people of Israel on that day, says Yahweh. I will put my instructions deep within them and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Let's take a look at that word instructions. I will what? I will put within their heart, right? I will write what? I will write within them my law. You see that right there? My law. Okay. Strong's Concordance number H8451. Torah. Torah. Boom.
Strong's H8451. Torah. Torah.
So what? He's going to write what on their hearts? Torah. Some of y'all New Testament Christians may need to go back to the Old Testament and read that verse, because that's the only mention of a new covenant. In fact, the writer of Hebrews tries to help us understand that idea of there being two covenants, one being the captive bride, one being the free bride. Okay? The one who makes a choice to come to Yahweh versus the one who's rescued from the nations instead of being put to death with Egypt. How? Through the blood of the Lamb. Oh boy, we could go on and on about that, couldn't we? We could go on and on about the idea that if you didn't put the blood of the Lamb on the doorpost, your firstborn died. So what actually activated any salvation in that process was the blood of the Lamb, but also the obedience to do it. And Egyptian or Israelite could do that. Okay? Now, moving into the other attributes of this process, we arrive at an activation of salvation and deliverance, and then we go to the side of what? Redemption and of sanctification. What do I mean by that? He did not sanctify the people of Israel per se. He did not redeem the people of Israel per se when he brought them out of Egypt. But when Yeshua went to his death, Yahweh, the intensification of all power in the universe, manifested as we understand him to be a father and a husband, made him who knew no sin to become sin for us that we might become the righteousness of God. Why is this important? Because then we understand that there was an imputation. There was an opportunity for us to be the righteousness of God regardless of our merit. Now, the function becomes relevant when we realize that the captive bride still had to please the husband. If he didn't please her, if she didn't please him, he had to let her go free into the nations. right? To go out of his house, out of his land, go free into the nations. And she was not a slave, and he could not sell her. Okay? Okay. Let's get back to our board. So getting back to our board, and specifically the cycle of Israel, we can see that there is this concept of this Yeshua principle being activated. All right. And so that's Passover. That's the point in time where Yahweh looks into the nations. He sees a bride who's attractive at Passover and decides that that's who he wants. And that becomes the nation of Israel, right? The nation of Israel. But now they are brought into what? They are brought into the wilderness season, right? Wilderness season. Now, why is that important? Wilderness season is a decline in the physical. How do we know? I will show you how we know. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Okay? Deuteronomy chapter 8, and that's going to be verse 2. Remember how the Lord your God led you through the wilderness these 40 years, humbling you and testing you to prove your character and to find out whether or not you would obey his commandments. But now watch this. Yes, he humbled you by letting you go hungry and then feeding you with manna. Okay. So basically then what we are talking about here is the concept of the threshold, right? How does the threshold work? Well, in its simplicity, there's a point in time of adversity. That adversity is a time in which something very specific happens. After that adversity, you are what? Shotgunned into the next season. That next season, you will not be able to turn back from. So if you make the choice to go the wrong way, you're shotgunned into that season. You make the choice to go the right way, you're shotgunned into that season. Now, why is this important? Well, first of all, I think, so it's like this. The adversity causes you to step into a state of needing to overcome, okay? We're going to talk about that in a minute because that's the elimination of infestation. Adversity is always a result of infestation of some sort. Elimination of infestation and eradication of the social unjust nations, right? And what? An insertion of order upon a chaotic process. Yes, in the end, this comes down to chaos and order, and we're going to get to that. But the chaotic process then has order asserted upon it. And then, of course, that assertion of order upon it is the overcoming of it. And then what? A shock point. And that shock point slingshots you into that next season. So there's always shock points. Well, there was a shock point for Israel. What was that shock point? That shock point was Meribah, right? The waters of Meribah. What is that? That is where they said, God brought us out into the wilderness to die of thirst, right? And what happens? Moses strikes the rock, water gushes out, and they call the place Meribah, which is testing, because they tested God there to see whether or not he was God, right? Okay. So what are they acting like there? They're acting like the nations who don't believe in God. Look, they just had this massive deliverance, right? The Red Sea, the plagues, Moses, going in and standing up to Pharaoh, who had oppressed them for upwards of 290 some years, I think it was. And so now all of a sudden we have this function of clearly these are supernatural occurrences, but they don't get it, right? So they go out into the wilderness. They have this time of testing, as it were. Let's read it one more time for memory's sake. Remember how Yahweh, your Elohim, led you through the wilderness these 40 years, humbling you and testing you to prove your character. We're going to get to that. And to find out whether or not you would obey his commandments. Yes, he humbled you by letting you go hungry and then feeding you with manna, food previously unknown to you and your ancestors. He did this to teach you that people do not live by bread alone. Rather, we live by every word that comes from the mouth of Yahweh. Okay, we're not going to get into they're not having any blisters on their feet and their clothing not running out. None of that. We're going to go with just this one premise. The physical decline in provision resulting in what was supposed to be a spiritual elevation, but instead is an exposure of their dark hearts. And he says that in Deuteronomy 8:2, and then explains how he did it in 8:3, right? And explains why he did it in 8:3. But here's the premise. The manna did not come until the people were hungry. The people cried out to God in an inappropriate manner. They did not say, hey, you're supposed to be providing for us. Where's the food? They said, you brought us out here to die. And they say something along the lines of, we don't understand why you didn't just kill us in Egypt like everybody else. Quite an accusation, right? Okay. So now what we need to do is integrate that into our diagram, right? Okay. So what do we've got here? We've got a physical decline, which we can definitely define as hunger, right? But that seems to accompany what should have been a spiritual incline, right? Okay, and we understand that there's a threshold or shock point here that propels us into the next season. Okay, shock point. In fact, I'm going to change the color of the shock points in order for you to better understand what we're working with here. So here is a shock point. Oops. So here is a shock point, and here is a shock point. And this is a threshold. This is a slingshot to the next point. Okay. And this is a threshold. And then, of course, there is a slingshot into the next season there as well. Because why? There's a reaping and sowing season, and the sowing season is after the harvest, right? Okay. Now that gets us to our current season, right? We are what? In what's known as the Passover season. Why? Because from this point all the way to this point is the season of Pentecost. From this point all the way to this point is the season of from that point to that point is the season of Passover. From this point to this point is the season of Pentecost, meaning what? The season in between the feast days is actually the season of Tabernacles. That's important when we get into the book of Revelation, but we're not there right now. Okay. Meaning what? From this point to this point, which is what? From Egypt to Sinai was the season of the Passover. In order to get to Sinai, right? In order to prepare their hearts for Sinai, they were brought through something. So now let's go back to this bridal thought process. The bridal thought process is that this point in time from Passover to Pentecost is designed to expose her expose her blemishes and accentuate her beauty. What is the difference between the blemishes and beauty? Well, in its simplicity, it is her impurities. It is the adulterous heart. It is that darkness within her that eventually arrives at the golden calf, which we'll get to in a minute. But the bride of Yeshua present in the wilderness during the time before manna is exposed in what? A darkness that eventually arrives at them not going into the promised land. This is what it says in the Psalms. This is like the waters of Meribah for me. I swore in my wrath that generation, what generation, who was at the waters of Meribah, would not enter my rest. I was angry with that generation for 40 years, and they all died in the wilderness, except for Joshua and Caleb, who obviously did not violate but did not have their darkness exposed during the waters of Meribah. So now what we need to do is factor in the process that Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles is about the bridal process, the choosing of the bride, the betrothal of the bride, and the consummation of the marriage. Tabernacles being the consummation, well, Yom Kippur being the consummation, and then the preparation, and the marriage feast being that wedding week, right? That time of going in and having that privacy between the man and the woman for an entire week before they finally emerge as the bride and groom. And then we have the function of Pentecost being the betrothal, the proposal of the covenant and the drinking of the cup. Okay? Why is all that relevant? Well, because when we talk about the exposure, we know that the adversity of the wilderness season was a single individual making a choice to reject the trust that Yahweh was going to provide for him if he was willing to deliver them. If he's willing to bring you into the adversity, he's willing to give you a way out of it and be provided during it. Remember that. Okay? And so if he's willing to pull you out of limitations and bring you into the wilderness season, then you should understand he's also going to provide for you. Now, this is what I have experienced. The wilderness season ceases to be so destructive when you change your thought process on it. Okay? All right. Now, that all is built into the thought process of that the hunger exposes the heart. Anybody been hangry before? There you go. That's the principle of the bride's blemishes being exposed. Each individual son of Adam or son of God, what? Having the darkness of their heart exposed. Well, that is all based upon something called the counting of the Omer. The counting of the Omer is a 49-day introspection into the 7 spirits of God, into the 7 attributes of God, which is going to be mercy, judgment, humility, leadership, bonding, endurance, and beauty. Okay, those are the 7 spirits of God. In that process, there's a meditation upon those to what? To expose the true nature of the person at that moment. Now, if you follow Augustine's crap, you were born to break those rules. You were born to be dark and have that evil. When the truth is that your nature is actually based upon your identity. Well, he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us that we might become the righteousness of God. What is your identity? It says that we are what? We are sons of God, children of God, right? We don't have the spirit of slavery again to fear, right? But instead have the spirit of adoption by which we cry, Abba, Father. And if we are children of God, then we are heirs, joint heirs with Christ. He left us responsible for the sonship. That's each individual. But each individual making up the corporate bride is making the choice to what? To elevate or not elevate. Okay. All right. So that's relevant and important, but that's just going to get us to the point where we understand the corporate collective conscience versus the individual when it comes to the wilderness season. Each individual's adversity of the wilderness season is custom tailored for the wilderness season for that individual. Remember, it is an adversity designed to be overcome. And after overcoming it, you've made your choice. There's a shut point that shoots you straight into the next season that you can't turn back from. Whether that be in your purpose or whether that be in a destructive loop of your wounds, your limiting beliefs, and your lack of imagination, lack of identity. Why? Because it's not what you do that makes you who you are. It is what you believe about yourself that you will do. Your identity is not based on your behavior. Your behavior is based upon your identity. What you believe about yourself. You are the righteousness of God, then obviously you're going to do righteous God type of things. You're going to be the opposite of that, then obviously that is going to be your identity, and that's going to be your actions, and that is going to be your shock point, and that's going to be your threshold, etc., etc. All right. So that gets us to the point where we understand that the feast day season is a judgment, either as a force of benefit to those who what? Want to be obedient to the feast day season, or a curse, a diminishing of self, a diminishing of value, including your assets. Okay. Now, why have this ascendancy and descendancy going on? Why have this elevation of spiritual action versus this decline in physical comfort? Why have a decline in spiritual and an increase in physical comfort? Why have all of those things? Well, one of the things you need to remember is that you are still human. You can only handle so much discomfort before you become embittered. In fact, there's actually a scripture that says that you cannot keep disciplining a person over and over and over and over again, because they will then what? They will become embittered towards the discipline and therefore will not be interested in keeping Torah. Somewhere in the prophets, I can't remember where. Maybe during Midrash we can try to find that. But here's the part that's relevant to today's message. Like, we just spent all that time getting here. I know. Okay. So here's the concept. Why have the physical decline in the first place? Why not just have a constant plateau, a constant increase and then plateau and holding of the supernatural enhancement and mountaintop experience, as it were? Now, you could go through the philosophical theory that it's because you forget who you are and need to remember through those adversities We could go there, but that doesn't make any sense because the adversity embitters you, right? Even if you do overcome it, it's an anguish to you that's imprinted upon your DNA, passed to your children. And in addition to that, is a memory of bitterness with God. Why would he do that? Why would that be initiated that way? Why would that be a concept? It's not. So let's talk about how this works, okay? We can go through and we could blame the last person, the last generation, all this stuff. But what we're going to do is we're just going to go with these words from Yeshua. You will always have the poor among you. But what does the commandment say? You shall not have the poor among you. But then right after that explains how to take care of the poor. What's the point? The point was not necessarily that we would eventually eradicate poverty, like some would think, but instead, all Torah is a measurement of how close we actually came to the bullseye. You see, Christianity and maybe even some of the other world religions have a tendency to look at sin as an indicator of how far away from the mark you really are. But the truth is that it's actually how close you came. Sin shows you how far you've come. I want you to think about this. Look back on, say, the last 5 years and look at how much you've grown. The way that you know that you've grown is the times when you've made mistakes and gotten back up from them. That's the growth, right? Growth is not necessarily the experiences where you learned something and actually were able to accomplish it. Those aren't remembered. The ones that are remembered is where you made the mistake. And so from now on, you mentally say, I'm not going to make that mistake again. Right? Now, whether you do or don't is irrelevant. You have learned to adjust your brain to not want to. And what's crazy about it is when we don't want to do something, we don't do it. Think about how hard you have worked in the past to say, be obedient. Let's say when you're a little kid and you have a rule, you're not supposed to go outside the fence. The fence has this big old gate, has this big old fence, and you're not allowed to go out there. And you're told, don't go out there. And there's this child-proof lock on the gate. You spend hours working on trying to get through that lock in order to get outside that gate, even though you were told to stay inside the fence, right? That's the principle of Torah. What's on the other side? Cars coming by, gonna hit you, run you over, right? That kind of thing. All right. All right, so now we're going to get to the next part of this. And I think this is the part that's really, really cool. Okay, so let's get our minds wrapped around the tent in terms of the feast days, okay? So let's see. We probably need a new board here, okay? And so we got our tent. Oh yeah, that's cool. Let's do purple. That's a good idea. Okay, we have our tent, and let's just draw a little door here. Okay, we have our tent, and so we understand. And in fact, let me go ahead and I'll put some dots here so you can see this back wall. So we have this wall, this wall, this wall, and the wall we can't see on the backside, right? So let me go ahead and get rid of those real quick. So you understand there's 4 walls to a tent. One of those walls opens and closes. That's the door, right? But what does the tent have inside of it, right? It has first provision. Okay, provision. I don't think I spelled that right. The next one is protection. Right? And the next one is instruction. This is what the tent contains. Okay. Instruction, provision, protection, and instruction. Now, there are two paths out of the tent. In fact, we're going to put them in different color. There are two paths out of the tent, and we're going to go with red as one of our paths out of the tent. Okay. Two paths out of our tent. The first one is what? Shame. Right? It's a shameful thing to leave the tent. What is the next path? The next path is what? Tame. Shame and tame. Easy to remember. Shame and tame. So let's talk about this. Shame is the result. Oops. Let's keep that red. Let's keep that red. Shame is the result of exposure, right? The Hebrew word bush, right? To be shameful, to press away from the tent in the ancient pictographic Hebrew. Not going to get into that today because of the amount of time we got to spend talking about this. So the principle is leaving in order as a result of shame is basically a ego process, okay? An ego process. And leaving the tent as a result of tame has two processes to it. Number one, it will be the result of instruction, okay? So shame will be the rejection of instruction. Let's not put that in green. All right. And actually, you know what? Let's label it this way. Let me do this right here. This is actually what I want to do. Shame is reject. Okay. Tame is receive. Okay. Shame and tame of what we got going on here. So what do we know about shame? Shame is going to be a rejection of instruction. Let's talk a minute about what that means. So first of all, two things that we need to understand. The first one is that when we are within the fence and obedient, the parent is not going to be reactive to the disobedience. The parent is going to be content that their child is safe because they didn't go outside the fence and get hit by the car, right? Won't necessarily reward the obedience per se, right? And they just want them in the fence, and that's that. Well, that's not quite how Yahweh works. Yahweh says, you're in the fence, I'm going to explode your life with blessing. But if you go outside the fence, you're going to have a one-off reduction in your blessing. What do I mean by that? Well, let's talk about that concept of the peach tree, right? You drop a peach pit in the ground, you grow this tree, and there's all these peaches on it from one peach pit. That's your sowing. That's your sin. You've dropped it in the ground. Now, boom, there's this huge tree full of sin. Well, according to Torah, it's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It's a one-off. It's not two teeth for one tooth, right? And so as a result of that, you have to reap what you sow, and that reciprocation is one peach. You sowed a peach in the ground, you have to eat one of those peaches. All the rest of the peaches on that tree, gone, right? Not a part of the process because Torah is just and says one for one. And then we get into that mitigating process by which it's not necessarily one for one. We have to check and see if we need to apply mercy, chesed, to the what? Din or Gevarah, judgment. Okay, so now getting into that thought process of the one-off, let's look at the other side. Drop into the ground obedience, and what? You get the whole tree. The whole tree. Okay. And so he says, I want to explode your life for staying in the fence. Okay, so what does that mean? We leave the tent in shame because of a rejection of instruction, which means what? We abandon Romans chapter 8, verse 4, for the righteous requirements of the law are what? Fulfilled in us who walk according to the Spirit, not according to the flesh. For the deeds of the flesh are death, right? So what do we know about the flesh? The flesh is not this. It's not our hungers. Yahweh did not create junk. You get hungry for food because it is something within you that you have as a legitimate created desire in order to activate the principle of provision. Why was that important? Because Yahweh's internal desire, his singular purpose, is to pour out upon you everything benevolent. Okay? Our singular desire to receive that is not wicked. But a corruption of that is an activation of the flesh, which is ego. What does the ego default to? Instinct. We have built into us an instinct to self-preserve. We have built into us an instinct to connect. And we have built into us an instinct to reproduce. However, we will not activate social justice when we are operating within our ego because it is a self-centered process. It is a dependence process. Okay? And where you're surrounded by a bunch of dependent people who are expecting everybody else to take care of them. You're expecting somebody to take care of you. They're expecting somebody to take care of them. And they're expecting you to take care of them. And you're expecting them to take care of you. When the truth is that's dependence. We need to move to a state of independence in which we don't require external validation. We don't require information to accept and understand our identity. And our provision, protection, instruction comes from a higher source anyways, because we understand that Solomon, arrayed in all of his glory, was not like one of those flowers. That the sparrow who eats without effort is not like you, who is more valuable than the sparrow, etc., etc., etc. And so now when we step into that process, we need to understand that a person who has walked away from the tent, who has rejected instruction, is in a state of ego, which is what? A weak mind. Remember, the weak mind is what? It is what we translate that Hebrew word to the word evil. Now, why is that important? That's important because now we understand that a weak mind is going to wound people, right? Now we have the instruction to actually go outside the tent and tame what? Animals and crops. So we're going to go out and we're going to sow and cultivate, right? And water. We're going to go out and we're going to put a yoke on who? On the ego of the person who walked away from the tent, which is in its simplicity the instruction of the heart according to the renewed covenant, where it has been written upon the hearts, right? Okay, and so that principle then equates to a necessity to go tame the animal. Who's the animal? The ego-driven, shamed person who went outside the tent. So now the reason why we have the decline or the descending is a result of the process of going out and taming the person by placing a yoke upon them. Which yoke? Well, Yeshua said, my yoke is what? Easy. My burden is light. And Yeshua was whom? Torah. The Torah became flesh and dwelt among us. John chapter 1, verse 14. So now in that process, we understand that the only reason we are to go out the tent is if we are to go and what? Join the ego-driven, shamed person to place a yoke upon them to return them to the tent. Okay? So how is that? That is actually a descendancy. So now watch this. If we go into Romans chapter 9, okay, I got Romans 5. I apologize. Here, let me go ahead and pull that up so you guys can just see how human I actually am. Okay, so Romans chapter 9. Oh, actually, it's 10. Okay, and here we go. I'm sorry, it is 11. So when we are talking about the concept of going up and coming down, we need to think. Actually, you know what? Let me do it this way. Deuteronomy. Let's do it this way. Deuteronomy chapter 30. Okay. And very specifically, he calls heaven and earth, right? Today, in verse 19, he says, "Today I've given you a choice between life and death, blessing and curses. Now I call on heaven and earth to witness the choice you make. Oh, that you would choose life, that your descendants might live," right? You make this choice by loving the Lord your God, obeying him, committing yourself firmly to him. This is the key to your life. And if you love and obey Yahweh, you will live long in the land Yahweh swore to give to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But this is what it says here. This command I am giving you today. You know what the pulpit teaches? Let me talk about this for a minute. The pulpit teaches that the Torah is so difficult to keep that we needed Yeshua to come along and keep it for us. And then that means we don't have to keep it anymore. Well, if God is the same yesterday, today, and forevermore, and he's a just God, and he put requirements upon the nation of Israel, his bride, right? Are we not the bride? Is not the church the bride? Israel, the bride, right? He puts these requirements upon Israel, the bride, his captive bride, right? He puts those requirements upon them. And this is what he says. This commandment I'm giving you today is not difficult for you to understand. It is not beyond your reach. It is not kept in heaven so that you, so distant, that you must ask, who will go up to heaven and bring it down so we can hear it and obey? It is not kept beyond the sea so far away that you must ask, who will cross the sea to bring it to us so we can hear it and obey. No, the message is very close at hand, on your lips and in your heart, so that you can obey it. Okay? Now, what Paul does is he says, okay, you know what? I'm going to build on that. He doesn't change it. He doesn't alter the interpretation of it. He says, I'm going to build on that, right? So he sits here and he says, who is it that would actually go up and get that for us, right? It is Christ. And so when and of course this is actually the verse that says Christ is the end of the law, right? The end of the law. And so in principle, when we're thinking about this, this is the core of a Protestant process. A Protestant says Christ was the end of the law. We don't have to keep it anymore, right? So when we're thinking about this, Moses says, who will go up and get it, right? Who will go up and get it? And then, who will descend and ascend? Now, Yeshua gives us it's not a model, because a model kind of is this idea that you have to follow this specific set of steps. Yeshua descends, right? he descends, bringing himself as Torah to the what? To the world in the realm of height with depth time. Calls himself the Son of Man, not the Son of God, right? Calls himself the Son of Man, and then at times references his title as Son of God. It can get confusing because Ezekiel is called the Son of Man, but clearly has manifestations, or for that's not the best word to use, clearly has revelations as a son of God, like what's mentioned in Romans chapter 8. So if you haven't gotten it by now, it should start to click a little bit, the principle that in order to go outside the tent, you have to become a son of man, right? You have to descend into the realm where that person is at. But you have to be the light in the place of darkness. Because outside the tent is exposure, right? It is the word for dryness. It is the word for nakedness. It's the word for shame, right? And so in that thought process, now we understand whom we are going out to tame. Now, what does that mean? That means that you will go out to tame those who were not able to handle the instruction, and you're going to place a yoke upon them, right? You're going to place a yoke upon them that will lead them back to the tent, right? And the evidence and proof that that yoke is easy and light is mentioned here in Deuteronomy, where it says, don't say that it is too difficult. Don't say that it's in heaven where we need to go up, right? Where we need to go up, and then don't say that it's below that we need to descend, right? So what is that concept then of heaven and descendancy versus going up, right? That is that concept of Yeshua coming down, right? Becoming the Torah becoming flesh and dwelling amongst men. Let me ask you a question. Did Yeshua ever emanate an energy or a frequency of ego? Do we ever see any demonstration in his behavior of there being a inappropriate process of ego as a result of some adversity or reaction to it? Now, some people say, well, what about when he cleansed the temple? Okay, so my short response to anybody, right, who says that Yeshua got angry, read the details. He made a cat o' nine tail and then whipped people as he drove them out of the temple. It takes upwards of 3 hours to make that. So either he is in a very deviant state of maliciousness as he's fashioning this thing made of metal and glass and leather, right? While he's making it in the realm of height with depth time, where he actually has to use his hands, actually has to shape the leather, actually has to insert the sharp pieces, right? And all that time he's like, you really think that's how the intensification of all power in the universe stuffed into a human acted? He didn't operate within his ego. He sat there and knew that this is how he was going to have to drive out these people. He knew that that's the level of discipline that was required to cleanse the temple, to cleanse the temple, right? Okay, and so we don't see Yeshua operate within the realm of ego, but he clearly went outside the tent to tame and to cultivate. He is our model. So I want to show you this, but I want you to look at it in a very different way. Okay? So here we go. So in Romans chapter 10, verse 5, for Moses writes that the law's way of making a person right with God requires obedience to all of its commands. Now, this is horrible, horrible wording here, right? But faith's way of getting right with God says, don't say in your heart who will go up to heaven. Who said that? Moses. When? When he said it wasn't hard to keep the commandments. Doesn't that contradict verse 5? Doesn't that? Okay. Either we have one of three things going on here. Okay. First of all, we have Paul quoting Torah to make a point. Torah. How in the world can he quote Torah if it's been done away with? He can't use it as an argument, but he does, right? Now, it seems as though he's trying to indicate that the law is ineffective here, right? It seems as though that's what he's trying to show you. So here's the principle. Either A, he went off the rails, and he was no longer a Shomer Torah, which means he was a liar when he wrote Philippians, and he was a liar when he stood before the king of Israel at that time and said, what? I have a clear conscience before God and man. I am a Pharisee. All of that happened within that same context. Okay? So there's that. He rejected all of that, went off the rails, total heretic to what? Even the stuff that Yeshua taught. 2, he changed something, right? There's a change that occurs, which means all the people who were condemned by the prophets actually they're in a very different category than the rest of us. Or 3, this has been severely misinterpreted, and I mean from language to language, okay? Because why? He's saying here, listen to what Moses says, okay? Let's go back to Deuteronomy real quick, and you're going to see what I'm talking about here. Going back to Deuteronomy, right? The command I'm giving you today is not too difficult for you to understand, is not beyond your reach. It's not too hard. It is not kept in heaven so distant that you must ask, who will go up to heaven and bring it down so we can hear it and obey? What is this? 13. It is not kept beyond the sea so far away that you must ask, who will cross the sea and bring it to us so we can hear it and obey? Look in 14. No, the message is very close at hand. It is on your lips and in your heart, right? It's written on your heart. Now listen, today I'm giving you a choice between life and death, between prosperity and disaster. I command you this day to love the Lord your God and to keep his commands, decrees, regulations by walking in his ways. If you do this, you will live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you and the land you are about to enter and occupy. Oh, but if you refuse to listen, and if you are drawn away to serve and worship other gods, then I warn you now that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long and good life in the land you are crossing the Jordan to occupy. Today I've given you a choice between life and death, between blessing and the curse. I now call heaven and earth, 2 different things, to witness the choices you make. Oh, that you would choose life, that you and your descendants might live. Here's my point. There's one of 2 ways that you're going to go outside the tent. One is an ego trip. And that ego trip is going to cause you to operate within the realm of what? Manipulation, coercion, and force of what? The 3 instincts. Self-preservation, connectivity, and reproduction. which means what? You are going to be in an inappropriate process of those three things. Those three things are animal instincts. They are what? Son of Adam. However, they're a bad side of the son of Adam. They're a person who is stuck in their wounds, their limiting beliefs, and has a lack of imagination. In that process, their identity is what? What they think they are and they do, and their actions demonstrate that they don't believe that they are the righteousness of God. It doesn't matter whether they believe in Christ. It doesn't matter whether they don't believe in Christ. If they have gone outside of the righteousness of God, then they are going to operate within the identity they believe, and that is always going to result in social injustice. It's going to be a crime against humans in some way. Exploitation of the poor, exploitation of women and children, exploitation of the system, etc. Okay? And our job is that when we step into a state of a strong mind, which is a B'nai Elohim and not a B'nai Adam, that we have to descend back into a B'nai Adam and walk out and demonstrate, just as Yeshua did, that you are able to be obedient as a son of man. As a son of Adam, you were able to be obedient. You were able to cultivate the tree and not eat from the fruit. And that overcoming then shotguns you into the next season, right? That overcoming shotguns you in the next season, or that choosing to eat the fruit shotguns you into the next season. You cannot turn back from those seasons. But the premise is you have to descend when you leave the tent, which means that you cannot operate in high-mindedness. What did Paul say? Do not ascend to high-mindedness, but condescend to men of low estate. Right? Because here's the crazy part about this. When you go down, you cannot afford to be this guru with people who are still struggling in their addictions, who are still struggling in their codependencies, who are still struggling in their very existence, have no idea about energy, have no idea about healing, have no idea about the Yeshua principle or ancient Hebrew or any of that other stuff. It can be very difficult. And one of the things that sucks the most is there are friends, close friends, who are outside the tent that you have to go tame by placing a yoke upon them that they can handle, so that you can gently lead them back to the tent where there is provision, protection, and instruction, right? Because they went out the tent because of their hungers. Remember, it says we are led away by our own lust, led away from the tent by our own lust. And lust, when it is conceived, when there is an intermingling, then becomes sin. Sin is a transgression of Torah. That's where we get the idea of reject. Sin is a transgression of Torah, and that transgression of Torah will result in what? When it is fully birthed, is death. What is death? Death is lack and decrease. It is a diminishing. It is the curse. It is the removal of weightiness, the removal of value. Where does that go? That goes towards identity, right? He made him who knew no sin. Sin is a transgression of the law, right? Sin is a transgression of the law. Sin is a conception of desire. Desire is a leading away from the tent. He was in all ways tempted, but did not sin, which means he never arrived at being led away by your own lust. if you step outside the tent, you need to understand that that A is going to be adversity. It is not going to feel like the tent. It is not going to feel like provision, protection, and instruction. It is going to feel like the hot, dry, naked environment that it is. And now you have to navigate it with the superior mind to the weak mind who has chosen to honor the ego over the Elohim. Remember, you are stepping outside of the tent as an Elohim, but you are descending into height, width, depth, time, and you are descending into darkness. And as you descend into darkness, you are then trying to what? Tame the animal, not yourself. You've already been tamed. That's how you ended up in the tent in the first place. Which means what? Your reaction to the wilderness season, which will be hunger, a lack of protection, and thirst, which will cause you to curse God, will cause you to be embittered because he doesn't bring to pass those answers in those moments. And you will then say, God brought me out here to die. Do you know one of the most common phrases that is used during the wilderness season is, I wish I was dead? Instead of understanding that it is an adversity that actually is the threshold to the shock point that's going to shoot you into your next place of beautiful purpose. Or you fall into the temptation, you yourself get sucked into the shame, and you become one of those who needs to be tamed. And your season may or may not come again for a long time. As you begin to get tamed and brought back into the tent, then you start to elevate back into a state of a sound mind and of a superior mind, right? And when I say superior and inferior, the simplicity is a person operating in their ego is going to hurt somebody. A person who is not operating in their ego is going to be selfless and help somebody. So how do we get through this season? Here's the key. When you are operating within the season of the wilderness, you need to understand that you're outside the tent either because of shame or because you are an Elohim who has descended into a state of Adam. And as you are in that state of Adam, you are what? You have the knowledge. You understand what actually is going on in the wilderness season. And so you are out there to place yokes upon the animals and to plant seeds in the field, right? And in that process, you are cultivating. Well, it's important to understand also that this is the season of reaping. So you're not necessarily, I shouldn't say planting seeds, but you are cultivating the ground. You're preparing the ground after a harvest, right? So the premise is that in general, you're going to be harvesting. You'll be pulling in what you have done wrong, and you're going to be pulling in what you have done right. And that's the key to the wilderness season. That's the key to the feast day season. Every one of the feast days is associated with a harvest. This is the season of reaping. It is time to reap what you've sown. Now the question is what have you sown, right? Have you gone through the Yom Kippur process of repentance, and therefore it's a temptation again because you haven't fully repented until you're tempted by it again, and it becomes the threshold by which you become where you are shotgunned into your purpose. So what's my point here? My point here is that you are out here in the wilderness naked and feeling like you're in trouble or ashamed to yoke the animals in order to lead them back into the tent. So what does that mean? That doesn't mean you sit down with a friend and call them a pig-eating sun worshiper because they worship on Sunday and because they eat unclean meats. But you sit with them and you explain to them on their level at that moment the wisdom that they need for that moment. Which means what? You have to have a pretty sound knowledge of their doctrine and not feed into it. You have people who are not Torah observant who you're going to sit with and you're going to eat with and you're going to try to what? Assert that yoke upon their chaos. Let's talk a minute about chaos. And then we'll probably be close to being done. So I love to illustrate chaos in such a way that it can be soundly understood. So this is the simplicity of it. We got to understand that it's a sphere, okay? And there's really no way to two-dimensionally represent a sphere. I mean, I could probably draw a little shadow here, would kind of indicate that it's a sphere. But in general, then what we have is what? We have emanation. Okay? Emanation in all directions, absolute chaos, no limitations, no definitions upon it. Think of that as the intensification of all power in the universe. Okay? The intensification of all power in the universe, but also chaos, right? Absolute chaos. Now, along comes what? A limitation. What kind of limitation? A realistic limitation. That realistic limitation that now is going to assert itself upon the chaos is going to create a containment, right? A containment, a limitation being placed upon the chaos. And therefore, that means that there's now going to be what? There's going to be a control or order to the flow of that. All right? A control or order to the flow of that. And in that process, as we look at that, then we understand that this limitation right here, right? This thing right here is actually preventing and creating a definition, right? It's creating a definition. So now what we're going to have is we're going to have, oops, too much. We're going to have an order. Why did it select that one again? Okay, there we go. Just got to be a little more gentle with it, I guess. Right? Oh, did it again. Not quite sure why it keeps selecting the sphere. It shouldn't be. Okay. So now we have what? We have order within the chaos, as it were. And what's going to happen? Now we have a control point. So what we have now is we have all these light points bouncing around inside of the right? Bouncing around inside of the containment. And then we have what? We have a birthing, or we have a bursting forth. Let's see, how do I want to illustrate that? Let's just do it as an arrow pointing outward. So we have a bursting forth, but we have a controlled flow. Okay? A controlled flow. And that controlled flow has to go from a higher to a lower, or from a greater to a lesser. This is intensely a greater, but it's defined here, right? This is an intense greater. So let's switch here for a second. Okay, so now what we understand, we got what? We had chaos without definition, without control, without limitation. We add the limitation to it in order to what? Control the flow of it. So we add this is not the limitations I'm talking about with your wounds, okay? You add the limitation to it, control the flow of it, and now there is a flow outward in a direction, creating what? A vector, right? An angle or a direction and an intensity of force. So now what we have is a way to decide how it flows out. That always is going to be a greater. This is the greater, right? This is the vessel of bestowal, right? This is benevolence. And it is contained intensity of benevolence flowing towards a what? A lesser or a vessel of reception, right? Recall that the Hebrew word for receive is what? Kabal. Kabal. And Kabbalah is she receives. Okay, and so the principle is now this is being received. So let's talk about this. Who is the greater and how is this containment or limitation occurring? Well, in its simplicity, basically there is a definition given, a definition of some sort given. That definition is us. But we have to be in a state of reception in order for that to be possible. What does that mean? That means that there's an element of chaos built into us, within us, just totally circulating, flowing around, waving, surging, whatever you want to call it. And it's what? Contained. It's contained. It's contained for a purpose. There is a physical limitation present in this supernatural being. Why? Because we need to control the flow of chaos. We need to control the flow of the intensification of all power in the universe. And therefore, what is that flow? That flow is moving into the state of taming, right? We go outside the tent to tame. Well, here's the interesting thing about it. If you are in a state of being a greater, then you are in an absolute state of benevolence. Okay? That's important. You need to know that. You need to understand that. But furthermore, you are in a state of bestowal. Okay? Bestowal. And why is that important? Because you are actually asserting upon the realm of darkness gift, giving. That's important because you're not going outside the tent and taming by condemning. You are going outside the tent by pouring into the destitute, pouring into the malevolent. Because somebody who's gone outside the tent and is in a state of ego and shame is a malevolent being, which means they're going to try to steal your energy. They're going to try to control you. They're going to try to wound you. This is heavy because now all of a sudden you got to kind of take your licks and still give. Now you understand where you are to pray for your enemies. You are to bless those who curse you. You are to what? You are to give an enemy drink, right? A malevolent being, somebody who is bent on what? Exploiting those who are not only either inferior to them, but are also what? Exploiting those who are trying to help them. Oh, it's so frustrating. It drives me crazy when I help the poor and I know that they don't want to change. And I know that they are going to exploit my gift because they're in survival mode. They're in autopilot survival mode and they have no interest in the higher self. They have no interest in the fact that they are an Elohim. They have no interest in understanding that they are the change that this world needs. Being outside the tent can tempt you to be reactive like they are. Why? Because you're going through the same adversity they are, right? You're going through the same hungers. You're going through the same stuff. Now, that descendancy is to bring them in. But what's interesting is that there are two paths going on from Passover, right? There's one going up and one going down. We descend into the wilderness season in a state of benevolence to put a yoke upon the animals who need to be tamed, the wild animals, okay? But in that process, there is an absolute elevation into the stratosphere in the supernatural. You will experience amazing revelation. You will experience amazing states of being in which you will forget about those adversities, those hungers, whatever. And I have found that if you are in that state, a lot of times what will happen is abundance will come during the wilderness season so that you can go out and tame. And people are like, well, that's proof that the wilderness season doesn't exist. I've had people say that. They say, oh no, the wilderness season doesn't exist. I'm always blessed during this time period. Because your attitude. Because you're not actually going out there with your ego, and you need something to put on their back, so you got to carry something out there with you. Full vessel, out the tent, to dump. Concept. Abundance, outside the tent, to dump. Still probably hungry, still some adversity going on. Why? Because we still need the threshold to shotgun us into the next season. That's a given. But that principle then is expansion, right? So what is key here? If you want to get through the wilderness season, you need to start pouring out. You need to just dump, right? You need to understand that there is a part of you that needs to get rid of the darkness. There's still going to be an exposure of the heart, right? There's still going to be those things because why? Because we're in a constant state of flux. We're in a constant state of change, right? But the superior part of you, the part of you that has overcome, that's what I mean by superior, not that you're lording it over somebody. If I catch somebody actually judging somebody or coming down on somebody, trying to bring them back into the yoke, I'm telling you right now, they're going to hear about themselves. But the premise is that you are superior because you've overcome and they have not. That's it. When I say superior knowledge, all I'm saying is you know something more than they do. Right? That's it. That's all. But it makes you an authority. And it makes you a greater. And it makes you benevolent. And it makes you a vessel of bestowal, not reception. Now, granted, you have to receive all that abundance in order to distribute it. That's another story. But the premise is that you now have to go outside the tent too. Now, what about the people who aren't ready to go outside the tent? What about the people who actually are, maybe new to Torah, maybe new to trusting the Father, maybe new to the processes? Do they go through a wilderness season as well? Yes, of course. But they're not out there in their ego, and they're not out there to tame, right? They may be out there to learn how to tame. They may be out there to learn about their ego. But listen, our God, Yahweh Elohim, is not a harsh God. He's not up there waiting for somebody to fall, and he's not up there like with this electric fence. It's actually a really soft fence. Simplicity is it's a choice on whether you want the agency of benefit or you want the agency of diminishing. Simple as that. The agency of diminishing is eventually going to result in oppression and possession. The agency of benefit is going to result in you being financially, politically, and spiritually elite. But for what purpose? You don't just get up there and stay up there. We don't go and learn from the guru on the mountain and stay on the mountain. We go back down and teach people what the guru taught us. That's the premise here. So there's a simplicity to this and there's a complexity to this. The complexity is that you are kind of in a state of being a son of Adam and being a son of God at the same time. We know that. So is Yeshua. The only difference between him and us is that he never actually gave into those longings, those temptations, right? Which are ego exploitations of hungers that were put in us in order for us to receive provision, protection, and instruction from the intensification of all power in the universe, because his very purpose and function is the desire to pour out, not receive. We can't give anything to him. We cannot add to him in any way. Not one single act of worship, not one single process of word, of speech, of prayer, of song will even remotely elevate the intensification of all power in the universe. But it will elevate the Elohim. Okay? And so in that process, we are in a state of receiving and giving. And in that process, we need to understand that we are the change that this world needs. We are the light of the world. Remember, the field is the world. Remember, it said that it says that the sower sowed good seed and the bad sower sowed bad seed, but the field was the world. We need to understand that that's where the taming and cultivating occurs. Need to also understand that your adversity is most likely the result of a reciprocation, something where you sowed a bad seed. Don't think that your adversity comes for free. It doesn't. Torah doesn't allow that. But what Torah does allow is for you to receive an abundance for what? For overcoming. So Torah allows a discipline of 1 for 1, eye for an eye, but then allows an abundance based upon a single obedience. Where James says, oh, you know what? If you have broken one, you've broken them all. Sure, that's true, because it's a heart condition. But also, if you're obedient to one, you've been obedient to them all. Why? Because it's a heart condition. Okay. All right. So, in that thought process, I think one of the most important things to do is to understand that we right now are in a state of counting the Omer, which is an examination of Yahweh's attributes, of the intensification of all power in the universe emanations, and how they play a role in us as Elohim, and how they elevate us, right? When we are pouring them out of ourselves. Think about that concept of reaping and sowing. Think about the concept of the fruit of the Spirit. You see, the premise is that if there is a fruit of the Spirit of patience, why would you have patience unless it was needed? So the fruit of the Spirit is always the result of a deficit. Remember that teaching? So if the fruit of the Spirit is always the result of a deficit, that means that we're supposed to be pouring out those things. Pouring out joy upon what? A vessel of unhappiness. Pouring out patience upon what? A vessel of impatience. Pouring peace upon what? A vessel of conflict. That's rough. That's rough. I can tell you right now, this is not easy. And what's crazy is that we're going to be in the state of hunger and everything else, and we're out here trying to tame. But that is actually what we're supposed to do. We're the change that this world needs. We're not supposed to be waiting for someone else to change. And we are not supposed to be blaming someone else for the problems. We're the problem. We're the ones creating the wounds. We're the ones who have the limiting beliefs. We're the ones who cannot use our imagination for anything but fear. So you can see now how there is a responsibility built in here and therefore purpose. And in that thought process, then there is an element of anointing. In that principle, we have in our Haftarah portion a discussion about those anointed ones who are exploiting, who are not doing what they were supposed to be doing and being given that process. These are the ones who have gone outside the tent to tame and fell into the temptation and failed to tame, but then became the ego-driven animal. Welcome to the wilderness season. It's as simple as that. Night and day difference, and all of a sudden you are the ego-driven animal instead of being the tamer. And it happens that quick. That's what this season is about, to expose those things. To what? To expose the blemishes of the bride and to accentuate the beauty. Right? Okay. So I think you guys get it. I think you guys see that the simplicity of the wilderness season is just to respond in benevolence and bestowal. It is not bestowal to let something slide off your back. It is bestowal to let something slide off your back and then give energy back to a person who's trying to steal yours. This is not an easy task. It is not an easy thing. But I believe that if you've been in the tent long enough, you will understand that there's times where you need to go out and pour out. Okay? Yes, there's times for self-care. You know, I've preached plenty of messages about self-care. This is not about self-care, and I'm not saying to neglect that. I'm saying it's time during this season to go out and pour out. Okay? All right. So for those of you who are on YouTube, I'm going to go ahead and end this and say Shabbat Shalom.